Hi everybody and welcome to Pixel Politics the podcast. It's my pleasure to be joined by Jamie Woodcock. He is a lecturer at the Open University and is the author of a few books, including The Gig Economy, which came out in 2019, The Marx at the Arcade, which also came out in 2019. Well, that's a busy schedule, and Work in the Phones, which came out in 2017. Jamie has held positions at Goldsmiths, in London, University of Leeds, University of Manchester, Queen Mary, and a load of other universities and the University of Oxford. Thank you, Jamie, for joining me today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to come and talk.
Thank you. I can imagine you must be very busy, so thank you for coming on. Thank you.
Yeah,
so to start off, I wanted to talk to you about your first book, The Gig Economy. Now, can you explain to us a little bit about it, just a bit of synopsis around the book?
Yeah, so I guess the context for this book is I'm interested in work. That's what I do research about, is work of different kinds. And yeah, I'm interested in it because, work is something that most of us spend most of our time doing for most of our lives. Unless we've come up with a really good other plan that means we don't have to work, it's the thing that we're going to spend the majority of our lives doing. And so I think it's important that we try and understand it, and try and understand how it's changing. And the Gig Economy book, which I wrote with a colleague, Mark Graham, is really, it's intended as an introductory book to talk about what I think had become a change in work that loads of people were talking about. That work was becoming more precarious, that, we no longer were going to have careers, but we'd have sets of gigs, and we'd deliver food one day and do design on online platforms another day, or whatever it is. But really what we wanted to do with the book was to talk about where the gig economy came from, what's good about it, what's bad about it, and kind of give people a sense of a critical understanding of how work is changing in some ways.
Yeah, super interesting. From reading your book, I was having a look at it, and what I loved about it was sort of the critical element where you'd go in and talk about the gig economy and how the workers themselves, because there were very few protections in place, even though even recently in the news that's changed. Have you heard about the new developments in terms of protecting Uber drivers who can, I think it's now that it's not that they can log into the app, and then from when they log in, it then tracks how many hours they've done. But before it would be when they just enter a car or drive around and, per job by job basis. From your book and taking what you've observed in terms of the gig economy itself, are you seeing there's great developments there in terms of, where it's going, hopefully, with gig workers? Yeah,
so, one of the things that I think about work is always, there's always a bit of a contest in work, right? What does the employer want you to do, and what do you as workers want to do? Mm-hmm. And when in the Industrial Revolution, when people were working 12, 14 hours a day in factories, the employers had a big upper hand over workers, right? Yeah. But I think that dynamic plays out across all kinds of work, and I think what we're starting to see in gig work is the beginning of shifting back some of that power to workers. And so the recent ruling is a really important one around Uber, about saying these aren't self-employed drivers, they work for Uber. But also in Europe, Deliveroo and some of these companies are being fined for their practices. So I think there's the beginning of shifting around this, that work might be changing, but workers should still get a fair deal, right? And I think people beginning to organize and forming unions is a part of that.
So do you think forming unions has been particularly troublesome to unionize during COVID, because everyone's been online and it's difficult to kind of put things forward? Is that a problem you've seen? Has it gotten harder?
Yeah, so a lot of the research that I do is with groups of workers who are organizing. So the video game book is kind of about this, of a new group of workers that haven't been in unions before. And at the start of the pandemic, I was doing some research with some other groups of workers that were starting to organize. And, at its core, trade union organizing or organizing at work is a relationship. It's about building relationships of trust, right? That you can rely on your colleagues, that you together can get more from work, that, you have power together. And a lot of that is like, you build those relationships in person, right? Yeah. You meet each other at the workplace. Maybe you go for food or go for drinks after work, and you build those relationships. I think that stuff's harder to do on Zoom.
Definitely.
But on the flip side, I've been in union meetings with people who couldn't be in the same place. So having people in other countries or other parts of the country who can now connect with each other in a way that they couldn't do before. So I think, as with all these things, it's like, you lose the in-person stuff, but then you gain a new way to do things. And after the pandemic, I mean, whatever after looks like, I mean, who knows when that's actually going to happen. Like, the skills of using things like Zoom and the experience of using it will stay, and people can use both. And I think that's much more powerful,
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how everyone's workplace changes through just using Zoom. Yeah, because a couple of podcasts ago, we had Alex Sobel on, the MP, and he was telling me about how his surgeries are being, completely different, because he's just talking to people through Facebook chats or Skype chats, and it's a whole different ballgame. But he said that it allows him to talk to more people, because, otherwise people are sometimes not against, but don't want to go into the surgeries or feel a bit worried going in. So it just allows them to talk more to a greater variety of people.
Yeah, and I think this is important, right? I work at a university that did distance learning and online learning. Has done this since the 60s, right? The Open University, and a lot of the reason for doing this is to make higher education and university courses accessible to more people. And I think now we've seen, like, other people, whether it's MP surgeries or union meetings or whatever, that we can use technology to think through making these things more accessible to people. So, from my job, where, I teach students all over the country, not traditional students in what we imagine a student to look like, right? And I think post-COVID, we need to learn those lessons about how we make not only education, but other things more accessible to people.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a student myself at the moment, and actually I'm a student and I'm kind of doing the freelance stuff as well. So it's like it kind of all links in there. But as a student, like, it's been a bit strange, having to navigate the Zoom, and like, we have these breakout rooms. It's probably the same. You probably use breakout rooms with your students on Zoom. And, a lot of the students, like, they try to engage, but, they have their cameras off or whatever. So it's a whole new experience for everyone. It's definitely trying to develop our communication skills at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely.
I wanted to ask you about freelance work, because, like I said, I'm doing a lot of freelance work myself at the moment. And, I'm contracted in different some of my different jobs. But how does that compare to, say, so for example, freelance writer compared to, say, sort of a Uber driver? Is there protections in the future that perhaps could protect freelance workers online? Because if you're, say, working for multiple companies, isn't that difficult to kind of unionize and get people together if they're...
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? And I think, for people that are driving for Uber or are delivering food for Deliveroo, they might work for more than one app, but most people have like an app that they use. So, if you speak to someone delivering your food, they might sometimes use Uber Eats in London, but they're mainly Deliveroo, or they're mainly Uber Eats, and sometimes they use the other one. And in a way, they have a single employer. They have somebody that they can ask for increased rates. They have a kind of point of conflict with an employer. I think freelance work is much harder because there are a couple of issues, right? You have multiple employers, but you also have the risk of someone saying, "Well, I'll do this cheaper than Jack will,"
Yeah.
And you should hire me instead.
Yeah.
But the labor movement has dealt with these things before in the past, and I think there's a really good example in the film industry. So a lot of film work used to be on not so much freelance, but on like a film by film basis, and people were able to organize and were able to do things like, rather than saying, when I come to you as a company, I want this rate, or I want some individual thing, was to set industry-wide standards.
Yeah.
So to say a camera operator should be paid at least this. And then what that requires you to do is to tell, to build a network with other people to say, none of us are going to take rates lower than this.
Yeah.
And that's the tricky bit, right?
That's so tricky.
Is like, you have to build that sense of you're all in this together, that you can get something out of it. And I think, the last 30, 40 years have been one of unions declining. And so it's a harder context. But I think, what's been happening with video game workers shows that even in that context, people find a way to do these things. So, you might not be quite there with freelance work, but it's, there's some inspiration, right?
Yeah, definitely. For example, Gamers United, I think its main focus is game developers. Am I correct in saying that? Yeah. But is it cover sort of other industry workers, for example, writers or?
Yeah, so the game workers branch in the UK, which is a part of a union called IWGB, organizes across the games industry. So the kind of what people might imagine when they think of a game developer, like a coder or software engineer, but artists, sound, people that do testing of games. So, across the whole idea of everyone who contributes to making a game, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's really great. Yeah. So I came across a sort of an analogy online about the gig economy and freelance work and from freelance work to Uber drivers, and it was interesting to read some of your book and to understand that sort of there's a shift towards people wanting this sort of immediate service based, immediate services, for example, Uber or wherever that may be. But there's also a shift towards sort of a games of service model in the video game industry. For example, games such as Destiny, or maybe The Division or games like that. Is there sort of a shift towards that sort of immediate service-based model? Just people just wanting that more on-demand services. Are you seeing that across a lot of industries?
Yeah, I'm smiling because I have a secret addiction to Destiny, so I can definitely relate to that. It's my kind of, I dip in and out, and I'm currently in a dipping in moment, which I think, not to go on too much about Destiny, which I'm tempted to, but
we can. Don't worry about that.
Excellent. I mean, I think this is one of the interesting things about games is when we think about platforms today, which a lot of gig work is organized on, platforms happened much earlier in video games. So, I was using a platform to download and to buy games before I even knew what platforms were. So Steam, Steam was a platform for at first for me to be able to play Counter-Strike, and then later to start buying games. So that kind of model of not buying a physical thing, but going to an online platform and downloading it happened way, way earlier than the rest of the economy. And so I think there's a sense that games are at the cutting edge of some of these changes, maybe. So, we think about Netflix today. We were having games as a service way before Netflix. We had subscription models in games way, way earlier. Think about things like World of Warcraft, where you could buy the game, but unless you're paying a subscription to it, you're not playing the game. So, and I think in a way, this is like, there have been experiments with how to make money out of games, which when they've proven successful, they get spread out into other industries. So it's a kind of, I guess we can see maybe some of the broader changes in the economy when we look at games.
Definitely, and you've seen that with Xbox Games Pass. Yeah, and that's a hugely popular subscription service, and it seems to have taken like influence from Netflix as well, because you pay a certain fee and then you get all of these games, with it. And then I think PlayStation is now doing similar kinds of stuff with that. So it's a shift towards like a in-demand service that we all want, even if we don't want to recognize it sometimes. We all kind of want things instantly,
Yeah, although Stadia, the Google offering, has been a cataclysmic failure, right? And I think this is what's interesting about the video games industry is there's a sense that this is like a gold rush industry.
Yeah.
That, you make a game, you make money, you get an audience and so on. But there are also plenty of examples of, Google's not a small company.
Mm-hmm.
And it made, failed completely with that offering. But I do think there are some things that I think there are some kind of tensions around this stuff, right? Is we want games as a service, but we no longer own them. And this is the thing that always boggles me about Steam is, when I was a kid, I had a collection of boxes of games.
Mm-hmm.
I bought the game, then you could play the game. Whereas now you buy a license, that license could be taken away at any time. And not to kind of get too much into the weeds with this, but what happens to games that stop being immediately popular, that get pulled from the service? We lose a bit of video game history, which, there's, and this, I guess, is one of the problems with Netflix is, I don't know if you ever feel this, but I feel like I watch a narrower selection of things than I used to watch because it's easier to watch them on Netflix, and I don't hunt down things that are not on Netflix anymore. And so in a way, these platforms start shaping what we play, what's available, what we play, what's popular. And I think often we don't imagine that the platforms are doing any of this. We just think, oh, this is cool. I can now, log on to my Xbox and play whatever I want. It's like, no, you can't. You can log on and play what someone has decided it's possible for you to play, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Yeah, there's always a selection of games that pop up onto the store that they want you to just, click on and then get. For example, like it would be The Medium, which is an Xbox exclusive next generation title. They want you to play that, so they'll put it on the store, like in front of you. So it's like it's just it's like they know what they're doing, right, in terms of wanting us to play specific games, and it's just a very interesting model. I wondered if you've heard of there's a company called Game Lancer. Have you heard of Game Lancer?
No.
So it's a US-based company, and they've got all they're high profile. They've got celebrities such as, I think it's Kanye West, who sort of are backing it. It's basically like a freelance game website whereby they allow the gamers to kind of dictate what they want their prices to be and how much they want what other people to pay them to play games for them.
Okay.
So it's like this. You're seeing this sort of gig economy moving over to the video game industry in that kind of channel. Have you heard of that? You haven't heard of that before?
So vaguely, I've come across this. I mean, I did a couple of years ago. I did some research with Twitch.
Okay.
Which, I mean, obviously is not the same thing, but I think you can see elements of this with something like Game Lancer. There's a kind of, I guess it's like a meta industry that grows around online gaming. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'll tell you, my addiction story with Destiny, I think, is a useful one for making sense of this, right? So I grew up playing video games. Mm-hmm. My dad is a software engineer. Like, we had computers in the house when I was a kid, so I kind of grew up around games. And when you're younger and you have more time, there are big games and you can take on playing these huge games. Yeah. Today, when I finish a day at work and I think about playing, I have not played the new Assassin's Creed because I just can't face the scale of it. And I think I could play it for the whole evening and not even make a dent in it. And part of the issue with this is that what I really like, and I have a friend that recommends me niche indie video games that take like an hour or two to play. And I really enjoy playing these because, after a long day, you've got to get up in the morning, you can like have an experience with the game and it's over.
Yeah.
Whereas so many games today, like Destiny, are specifically designed to make you constantly play them. And so this is why I have this like in and out with Destiny, is I play it when I enjoy it, and then I brush up against the moments where I can tell that somebody has designed something to keep me playing, just to keep me playing. Like, some thing where you have to grind out, hundreds of this or hundreds of that. And I think, actually, this isn't fun anymore for me. And I kind of go away from it a bit. And so I think this thing of, being able to pay to have people play with you is kind of catering to that in a way, right? That if you've got more disposable income, you can have someone carry you through raid in Destiny, or you can pay to enjoy it more, right? You don't have to put in the effort that you would have put in when you were a kid. You can pay for it.
I'm on the same line of thought as you. Like once I've finished like a day of study or whatever, or I've done like a couple of writing pieces, I'm not going to play like The Witcher or a big Assassin's Creed game, because it is too daunting. Like, you have to put in hundreds of hours into these games and there's no end.
I think with Destiny, I get this feeling that whenever I feel like I have to make a to-do list, that's when I'm like, no, this is like too much. Like, there's too much going on here.
On your phone, and you're like, tomorrow I will, I don't know, like, I can't remember. I don't know, do like this challenge or whatever. I haven't played Destiny in ages. Are you like, continually playing Destiny with each kind of like, season or whatever? I think they're doing seasons. I can't remember.
So I took quite a long break from it.
Yeah, me too.
With the most recent season, I got back into it a bit more. I think there's things with Destiny, like there's been a scandal around sunsetting equipment, so making you have to re-earn everything basically. But what I quite like about Destiny is, I think in a way it's like one of the excellent examples of what happens to games under capitalism. So, for people who are listening who are not familiar with the game, there's a much memed part of the game where one of the characters says, I don't have time to explain why I don't have time to explain.
Yeah.
Because the original plan for the game had to get chopped up at fairly late stage of development in order to make what was going to be a much more ambitious game feasible for launch. So they just sliced up the storyline, and you end up with these moments where you're like, oh, somehow the creative process, something happened to the creative process here. And it was because, they had the marketing budget ready, they were ready to launch, and that was what took priority, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was in the first Destiny, wasn't it? With the Taken King. If viewers don't know, it was the Taken King that got left out of the main game, which is a huge expansion. And the game itself on its own was rather lackluster. It wasn't that, it was okay, but its story wasn't that great. It was just kind of like, you could see it was just melded together kind of in the last minute, but they had all of these story pieces that were left out that was added, and it cost us more to buy them through DLC, but they would give it to us at a later date. So it was a bit of a kick in the teeth, but I think you're right. And it also shows, at that point you had the big publisher Activision. I think it was Activision. Yeah,
at the time.
And they were with Bungie, and they were kind of like pulling the strings there. But I'm hoping that, because Bungie's now disconnected from Activision, that they're going to have more free reign, and I think that's going to start to happen with the new expansion. Are you excited about the new one that's coming up? Was it the Witch Queen? I think it's the Witch Queen. Yeah.
Yeah, but again, it's this issue of seeing how big it is and thinking, how much time do I have to get sucked into this? Which I think, but it's a funny thing, right? That there are, in terms of the other forms of culture and art that we consume, a Netflix series is only so long, a film is only so long, an exhibition is only so long, whereas games, because of the amount of money that can be made from them, can be these huge experiences that can have a different way of us relating to them.
Definitely. And I've actually produced a few pieces on how these games such as Destiny to allow communities to get together, and obviously you can make friends, but it's kind of like it's a lot deeper than all of that, and I don't think a lot of people realize you meet new friends, you build communities, and it actually kind of like is a way to socialize, especially during COVID. And it's fantastic. I love that.
And I think what's interesting about it too is like that happens in a contested way. So famously, Destiny is quite restrictive in voice chat. Because anyone who plays games with voice chat knows how horribly toxic these things can often become. So what I find interesting about that with Destiny is like people still find a way to communicate. So you find ways to communicate with people non-verbally until you can be sure that they're not going to be toxic and you might want to actually communicate with them. And I think that's I think it's interesting how they've dealt with that, because there are lots of other communities. I mean, League of Legends, for example, that is so vigorously toxic that it can be hard for communities to form. But I think one of the bits of evidence coming out of the pandemic is so many more people are playing so many more video games than they were before. And I have a good friend who lives overseas, lives outside the UK. For us, it's a great way to have a longer call and to catch up. And I think lots of people are seeing the other potentials of how we can fit video games into our life through the pandemic.
Definitely. Yeah. And, it's allowing us to socialize more, but like you said, more people playing video games. As we mentioned on the last podcast, it's bringing in a lot of economic value to the video game industry, and it's boosted its revenue considerably. And we mentioned previously, but it's the same sort of thing, obviously, that this wealth needs to be distributed to the people who need it, and not just at the top with the executives that are kind of, like I said, pulling the strings of these companies.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that I think always surprises people who don't know so much about the video games industry, is just how big it is, and how much money is involved. But then equally, as you say, how unequal the distribution is. That people who are testing video games are on low wages, precarious contracts, that developers work long hours to make sure these things happen. And it's an industry where a lot of the workforce doesn't have a lot of say over much of the work, which given how little CEOs do for making the video games themselves, it's a kind of a surprising thing to have happened, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. But you're seeing that more. That's coming to the forefront more, right, at the moment, and over the last 10 years, which is great news. People speaking out against workplace abuse or all kinds of different things, and now the media is kind of latching onto that and kind of spreading these voices about, so people get heard, and also that the big companies get held accountable. And that's something that you mentioned actually in the gig economy book, was that these big companies need to be held accountable in order to so that the workers themselves get protected. How can they be held accountable? Is this a government-led thing, legislation?
So I think that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things in the UK is there is good legislation to some extent on workers' rights. Compared to some other national contexts, there are relatively good protections. One of the problems in the UK is if you break employment regulations, there's very little that happens. So I often hear stories about young workers who don't have pay slips, who don't get holiday pay, who they work out their wages and they're paid less than minimum wage. The chances of an employer getting inspected are something in the region of once every 400 years. It's the average of when you would be inspected. So basically, you'll never be inspected, right?
I was going to say.
Yeah. It's quite a nice statistic, though, right? Because it really puts it into perspective that, you're not going to get checked up on these things. And one of the main ways that lots of workers can get those rights is going to what's called an employment tribunal, which is a kind of legal avenue for enforcing your legal employment rights. And at the moment, if you had an issue at work that had to go to the tribunal, you'd be waiting as a minimum 2 years to get that heard, because there's been so much during the pandemic that has happened. And so I think in a way, like, we should always call on the state to enforce regulations, to make Uber, Deliveroo, all these companies meet the requirements that they should to pay holiday pay and sick pay and so on. But ultimately, the history of work shows us it's not well-meaning regulators that change these things, but it's people getting organized and demanding those changes. You need that pressure from workers to get change.
Without a doubt. I was reading about the recent, as we already mentioned, the ruling by the Supreme Court, which improved the legislation for the Uber drivers. Is this something for the Uber drivers themselves? Is this something that is going to be more spread? Will it impact, say, Uber Eats or Deliveroo drivers or Just Eat? Because I heard that because there's no labour inspector or no one to sort of inspect the labour itself, are other companies just going to get away with it?
So that's a good question. The way that employment law works in the UK is, what's happened at Uber is a group of workers have taken a claim for worker status. Then, there are 50,000 Uber drivers in the UK. And I think a dozen or so who originally took the case. So it's now up to Uber drivers to try and enforce those rights. Unions will now support workers to take claims for backdated holiday pay, minimum wage claims, and so on. So what will happen following that case is there will now be like a wave of people trying to enforce their rights. And Uber, much like they have in other countries, will do their utmost to ensure that doesn't happen. But I think for other companies, so whether it's other divisions like Uber Eats or whether it's Deliveroo, this is an important signal that using a dodgy contract that claims you're not employed isn't enough. That companies can't get away with this. And so I was on a call earlier today with some Deliveroo riders, and they're looking at that case and thinking, well, if they can have those rights, why can't we have those rights? And so I think it's going to be a big inspiration to lots of people that actually there are things they're entitled to. And I think whether in the courts or through organizing, through strikes and protests, I think what we've begun to see is, I don't want to be there's always a temptation that we say it's all happening, but I think we have had a bit of a turning point, 2020, and then with lots of people saying, actually, I deserve better at work, and I deserve more. And I think the pandemic for lots of people has shown just how little employers care about many of the people that they either employ or pretend not to employ. And so I think there's a bit of a reckoning, right? Like food delivery, transport, care work, all these things kept all of us going through the pandemic. And, now these people should be paid fairly in response. So if that's one of the things that can come out of this pandemic, that would be great.
Yeah, without a doubt. The other thing is obviously that because they want to, enforce these rights, it looks like the companies themselves might actually increase prices on fares. Is increasing the price, increasing the cost on fares? Obviously, would that mean? I'm just assuming. Less people would want to take an Uber taxi or another service. Is this going to have a negative implication in the long term on the workers themselves?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and I think this stuff always comes up when people ask for wage increases, that we can't afford it, that it's not possible. And I think one of the things that's worth talking about with platforms is exactly how much the platform takes. So for many transport platforms, it can be 15, 20, sometimes 25% goes to the platform. With food delivery, they charge a delivery rate 20, and then they charge the restaurant a fee as well. And so for Deliveroo, some companies pay 30% of the order price, and then you pay a delivery charge, and then the worker gets a cut, which is often a tiny fraction of it. So I think sometimes this is it's a question of power. If wages have to go up, does it mean that the owner or the platform or the employer, are they the ones that will take the hit, or will it get passed on to customers? And I think Uber and Deliveroo and all these companies have huge PR machines that are going to say they can't do this and it's going to affect customers and so on. But I think if you have a business model that can't pay people fairly for the work they're doing, then you don't have a business model.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I completely agree with you. These workers need to be protected, especially during the COVID times where everyone's vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and we've all experienced that. The workers have the right health and safety regulations and measures put in place in terms of the social distancing and that. But what people don't realise is their actual the benefits that they get and the protection that they get behind the scenes isn't actually what people think. And they see someone turn up to the door and give them their food or whatever. But people don't realise that actually, they're not paid a lot of money, and if they are paid a lot of money, they're working a lot to do that, and there's no protection in place really at the moment, or there's going to be hopefully in the future to protect them.
Yeah, I mean, I think we often, we don't see what happens behind the screen often, and there is a deliberate reason for that. Is that these things? I think we were talking about this at the start, that these things sell themselves as an easy service. You don't have to worry about where the food's coming from, or if it's raining outside, how difficult it was for that person to cycle to your house or to get on a moped. Is like, you order it, you see it coming, you open the door, food arrives. There's this idea of let's hide all the messy work away. And I think for lots of people, I think what's been happening with those workers, whether having strikes or through the pandemic, is to realize that there are real people with real experiences that happen when you order something on an app, right?
Yeah, it's the same with game developers as well. The games that we play, people realise obviously that there's developers behind the scenes making the games, but they don't realise that sometimes they go through periods of crunch, or there's other issues in place that are impacting their work life, or their big bosses aren't treating them right. And so people don't realise that either. When you jump onto Warzone, it's you play a couple of games, but you don't realise some person has taken hours and hours of their day to try and implement a certain feature that you're using, but they might not be treated that well. Yeah,
and I think this is what the scandals around Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
Really was Cyberpunk 2077 rather than the original vision of Cyberpunk from the novels, which is quite a different vision to what CD Projekt Red has brought forward. I think a lot of people have looked at what's happened around that and realized, how some games are made and how unhappy or uncomfortable that makes people.
I think they were like a victim of their own success as well, because The Witcher 3 was such a big game and it's so well received. So they wanted to make Cyberpunk the best it could be, but at the same time they had that limited window, and they had to get a game out in a certain period of time, and that's obviously going to be of a detriment to the workers themselves. I think that like the games as service model, for example, Games Pass is good because it allows the games that go on the platform, on the GameSpa service, it doesn't give them that time frame and window to release a game by. They can just put it on there if it's new whenever they want, and then people can pick it up because they're not hitting a specific day and deadline for a press release. What do you think about that? Do you think that these games as service models can actually be of a benefit to the workers themselves, because it allows them to actually develop a game that's good and they don't have to worry about hitting a certain deadline?
I think that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought of it in that way. I mean, I think one of the reasons why this happens with big games is because, you know, we increasingly have a small number of very powerful publishers in the games industry that invest huge amounts of money in games in order to make huge amounts of money. And I think it's that dynamic that really shapes things like the story screw up with Destiny or what happened with Cyberpunk, is what you want. You know, there's this idea that what consumers want is a massive sprawling game. And so you need to make a massive sprawling game as cheaply and as quickly as possible in order to make people buy it. And the difficulty is, you know, managing the production of something like Cyberpunk 2077 is incredibly difficult. So predicting how long it will take, you know, I can't even imagine how you start mapping out how long that's going to take, right? And you know, I think this is the problem, that when we think of these things as like, you know, as an art form and as a cultural form, it's not just bigger is better, right? 2020 and then the football game 2021 and then the military shooter game each year, you know, that churning out these things that are reliable sales. And I think we lose out on the creative possibilities of video games as a form of play, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's the shame of it. You know, sometimes we lose out with the creative side of it, and we, forget about all the rest of it, which isn't good. I wanted to ask you about the Marx of the Arcade. Can you tell us a bit about that book? It's super interesting. You just tell us a tiny bit.
Yeah, so Marx of the Arcade is a book that is about Marxism, and it's about video games. And I wanted to write this book because I think Marxists have something interesting to say about video games, and I think video games have something interesting to say about Marxism. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of written with two audiences in mind. Like, one is saying to Marxists, like, you should care about this. Like, you should care about this industry. You should try and understand it. You should try and understand games. But then also saying to people that play games, Marxism can be useful and interesting for thinking about this.
Yeah.
And, in a way, the real, for me, impetus of writing it was the worker organizing that started in the video games industry. It felt like now was a time worth making that argument, because people were starting to think through what organizing at work means and looks like in the industry.
Yeah, it's interesting you made the comparison in the book about the military complex in the US, and how instead of designing rockets, these guys would design video games instead. And you compared it to kind of the hacker culture right now. You shouldn't be hacking these games, and you shouldn't be making your own version of these games, but you are, and you're doing it undercover. That's super interesting too. That analogy was great.
Yeah, and I think, what I like about those stories is there's always a risk where if we see something like the game worker organizing over the last couple of years, that we say that there's never been any resistance or organizing before that. And what I tried to do in the book is to say that video games are really contradictory. They have this history of people mucking around with things they shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
And then they have companies finding ways to make money out of it. But then you have people mucking around and doing things they shouldn't be doing again. Is that the creativity in video games is not driven by companies. It's driven by workers, by hobbyists, by fans, by people who care about the medium, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's just from the very beginning, it's driven by that. But Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure. Where can people catch you?
You can read all of my research online at jamiewoodcock.net. And yeah, there's things you can download and read. And yeah, the books that you listed as well. So yeah, thanks. A real pleasure to come on the podcast.
Take care. Bye. Oh, I completely fumbled the ending there.